So I'm pleased today to introduce Ken English, who has done considerable research over the last few years on Revelstoke during World War I. After his talk, I'm going to be reading a couple of profiles of some of the soldiers from Revelstoke who died during the war. That was one of Ken's major projects, was to identify all of the men from Revelstoke who died. There was about approximately 107, and he was able to find out information on all but just a handful of those men, just a couple that weren't able to verify. But it's been a tremendous project, and really a way of putting a real life to the names of the men on the cenotaph. This talk that Ken is giving today is one that he has delivered to the grade 11 social studies class for quite a few years. We've worked with the social studies teachers to present the World War I history and give them the Revelstoke perspective. So this is the grown-up version of that talk.
Excuse me, Ken, you said 107 fatalities. Was that for the First War?
First World War, and then 33 for the Second World War. So Ken, thank you.
The impact of World War I on Revelstoke. Dawn's early morning rays stream across the sky. Its warming rays illuminate the southeast stone surface of the Revelstoke courthouse, exposing to its light a bronze plaque upon which names of those long departed are engraved. For those of us who live in peace, dawn is a time of renewal, a time to begin again our daily tasks. For the soldiers of the Great War, dawn was a time for the beginning of battle. The coming of the dawn was a time of apprehension, of worry, of fear, for many knew that this could be their last day on earth, the last day they would greet the coming of the renewal of life. The poets of the Great War used the contrast between the dawn they knew before the war and the dawn they experienced in the trenches as a means of illustrating the contrast from the high idealism and confidence that guided their lives before the war and the new reality of the brutal, industrialized, mechanized world of death they now inhabited. Their noble war had become a war of attrition, where millions eventually lay dead on the battlefields, many thousands never to be found again, and remembered only by memorials. This experience led to the downfall of previously powerful empires and also redrew the boundaries of the Middle East, the effects of which we are still experiencing today. Many historians also believe this war may also lay the groundwork for an even more destructive war to follow. It profoundly reshaped Western European culture and has shaped the Canada we live in today. Our nation was forged in the fiery furnace that was World War I. It was forged in the battles of Ypres, the Somme, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and the final 100 days. The Great War also had enormous impact on the city of Revelstoke and affected every aspect of daily life. The Revelstoke Museum and Archives has compiled a memorial book with one-page summary dedicated to each soldier who died in the conflict. In this way, we hope to throw some light on this change and to remember the sacrifice of these men and the effect this loss had upon the families and friends they left behind. The museum has recently opened an exhibit dedicated to this remembrance. As Kathy mentioned, we did quite a lot of research, primarily through the Museum and Archives collections, which included the local newspapers of the time and through the internet, on the impact the First World War had upon the community of Revelstoke. Its greatest effect, of course, was the loss of life from our community. Around 100 men from this area lost their lives in that conflict. Probably 2 to 3 times as many returned from the war wounded in body and or spirit. I estimate that between 800 and 1,000 men from this area served in that conflict. So what was it like for a community the size of Revelstoke, with its population around 3,000 people within city limits and another 3,000 small communities along the CPR line east and west of Revelstoke, and farming and logging and mining communities north and south of town, to lose so many young men from its midst? At one point, the newspaper mentioned that 20% of the male population of Revelstoke had volunteered to serve. The vast majority of our young men no longer worked or resided here. The loss of all these young men from our community would have a significant effect upon the economic and social life of Revelstoke. At the initial outset of the war, there was great enthusiasm and patriotic fervor in Revelstoke. Canada, of course, as a member of the British Empire, was automatically at war when Britain declared war against Germany. This was to be a war that would stop German militarism and defend the values of the British Empire from German tyranny. At least those are the reasons given to the public. The actual cause of the war much more complex, but basically boiled down to a struggle for the balance of power between the major European countries: Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. In those years, the call of the British Empire for help defending itself from the evils of German militarism was very strong in English Canada, and Revelstoke was willing and eager to do its bit. An important question for me is what motivated all these men to join up and go off to fight. I had always viewed the First World War as one great useless slaughter carried out by incompetent generals. Who willingly goes over the top from the trenches to an almost certain death? Through my research, I have now come to appreciate why these men volunteered to fight for a cause they believed in, and why they carried on through so much slaughter and carnage. It also gave me some insight into why most of the people in English Canada supported the prosecution of the war to its end. Well, this story of the history of the Great War in Revelstoke has two parts to it. One is the story of the men and some nurses from Revelstoke who served at the front. The other story is that of the family and friends and fellow citizens of Revelstoke they left behind. Both stories are essential to our understanding of how Canada and Revelstoke became the societies they are now. Engraved on the plaque in the cenotaph are some 93 names of Revelstoke men who perished during and after the First World War. Before our research, I knew next to nothing about these men. Now I can pick up almost any name on that plaque and know something about that person. I now think what a privilege it is for me to be able to do that. Then I thought how important it is that somehow we all remember who these men were. They were just ordinary Revelstoke men living through extraordinary times. They answered the call to serve their country and the values they believed it represented. They did not return to share in the benefits our land can offer. The people of Revelstoke endured such days as June 3rd, 1916, when 6 Revelstoke men died at the Battle of Mount Sorel, and April 9, 1917, when 12 men from Revelstoke died at Vimy Ridge. Another 7 men died at Passchendaele in October-November 1917. Indeed, the cost of men from Revelstoke was high. One item I wish to emphasize is the tragic fact of war that many of the battle dead are never found or identified. Although about 3/4 of the Revelstoke casualties are buried in identified graves in France and Belgium, about 1/4 of the Revelstoke casualties, or about 25 men, were not found or identified and are memorialized on the Menengate East Memorial or the Vimy Memorial. Only 3 are buried in Revelstoke and 1 in Arrowhead. Another noteworthy fact is that 1/2 of the Revelstoke casualties occurred before the battle for Vimy Ridge in April 1917, and one half died after this battle to the end of the war in 1918 and beyond. A number of men died after the war from wounds, the effects of living in the filth of the trenches, or from being gassed. Many of those who perished still had relatives living in Revelstoke. Then, after the war, influenza struck the world. Another 30 residents of Revelstoke died from this outbreak, possibly a result of weakened immune systems caused by the deprivations of the war years. The real beginning for the First World War for Revelstoke begins in 1899 with the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. Canada sent over what one historian called our splendid little army in the field to assist the British. Apparently it acquitted itself well, so well that its success led to outgrowth of militia fever across English Canada. Drill halls were built in many large and small communities across Canada, including ours. Our drill hall, now the Trans-Canada Fitness Centre, was constructed in 1902. Men from this area had served in the Anglo-Boer War, and they became the core of our local militia, D Company, 102nd Regiment, Rocky Mountain Rangers. Many young men were attracted to this way of life and joined the local militia. It was considered a proud duty to have served in battle in South Africa for the glory of the British Empire. The young men of the day were also heavily influenced by the literature of the time, which portrayed the Boer War of 1899 and war in general as a glorious enterprise without much loss of life. It took the slaughter of the coming war to reduce the appeal of glory and adulation and adventure for these young men. So at the beginning of the war in August 1914, these were the men, or boys as they were known then, who were the first to answer the call of the Empire. Some 69 men from our city immediately signed up as volunteers. About 30 of them were chosen for what became known as the first contingent. Around the end of August, they passed through Revelstoke after some initial training at Kamloops. The passage of our boys through Revelstoke was, quite naturally, a significant event in Revelstoke history. The newspaper of the day carried it this way: "Hearty farewell to Revelstoke volunteers." One of the most striking demonstrations ever seen in Revelstoke took place at the Canadian Pacific Railway Station on Sunday, August 30th, 1914, when a citizen bade farewell to a contingent of volunteers from the city of Revelstoke who passed through on the midday train from Kamloops on their way to Valcartier. The station was thronged, and our troops were given the heartiest and most enthusiastic send-off. On the grounds of the Revelstoke Hotel, children from the two public schools and students from the high school were massed. It was an ideal situation for the purpose, as the children, the girls in light summer dresses on one side, and the boys in a body on the other, presented an effective picture as they saluted the arrival of the train with hearty cheers and the waving of many flags. The children then marched to the station, headed by the G Verdi Band. The city band was also on the scene, and along with the Civic Guard, carrying two large Union Jacks and the flags of the Allies, marched to the station and took up a position behind the children. The station was thronged, and the music of the bands, the singing of patriotic songs, cheering and waving of flags by the children, with a roar of welcome from the crowd on the platform, made a scene of animation which will long be remembered by all who witnessed it. The Revelstoke volunteers appeared to be in the best of health and spirits. They disembarked from the train and marched in front of the children and gave hearty cheers for Revelstoke. Each band was presented by the Women's Relief Society with a case containing socks, darning cotton, and other requisites, and a box of apples was placed on the car. Many flowers and other gifts were made to the soldiers. On Monday, a similar demonstration occurred when another party of Revelstoke volunteers passed through the city on their way east. The meeting of the trains carrying our volunteer soldiers was an important feature of community life in Revelstoke and during the war. At all hours of the day and night, citizens would make their way up to the train station and offer support to the soldiers. As mentioned in a newspaper article that I read, relief societies have been formed immediately upon the commencement of the war. A patriotic fund to financially support the families of the soldiers was established. The Women's Relief Society eventually evolved into the Revelstoke Red Cross Society. The High School Girls Patriotic Society was formed under the guidance of Miss Annie Eaton, who joined the high school staff in 1915 and taught there until 1922. She was an older sister to Judd Eaton, one of those 6 young men who perished on June 3rd, 1916. The high school girls assembled Christmas parcels, knitted socks, and sent letters to the former high school boys serving at the front. The museum has in its archives a record of the meeting minutes from the high school. The High School Boys Cadet Corps was also formed. The Red Cross became one of the 2 foremost organizations supporting the war effort in Revelstoke. Our local Red Cross Society sent off literally tens of thousands of socks, bandages, and other items to the war fund. They conducted many fundraising drives and always commented positively on the generosity of spirit and money on the part of the citizens of Revelstoke. Every week, it seemed, there was an article in the newspaper listing all their contributions and their supporters. They were consistently supportive of the war effort to its very end and beyond. A long-serving secretary was Mrs. Florence Soames, who sacrificed his son, George Soames, to the war. The other organization was the Women's Canadian Club, as the Canadian Club was known back then. They were instrumental in bringing to Revelstoke, by train of course, world-famous speakers and personalities, such as Nellie McClung, a Canadian suffragette trying to bring the right to vote for the women of Canada. One of her arguments for women to be granted the right to vote was that they were also making great sacrifices for the war effort and should be considered equal partners with men. Indeed, in the BC provincial election of 1916, referendums were passed by the male British subject voters of BC in favor of the prohibition of alcohol and the right of women to vote. And in the federal election in December of 1917, wives, mothers, and sisters of the soldiers serving overseas were given the vote. The Women's Canadian Club also did numerous activities to support the war effort. In October and November, they would organize a Christmas hamper campaign to fill and send off Christmas packages to our Revelstoke boys at the front. A tea would be held at the home of a prominent woman, and the women of Revelstoke would drop in, make their contribution, and be offered refreshment and entertainment. This was always hugely successful. Another activity they did was to meet the passenger trains and sell flowers to the travelers, all contributions going to the war effort. At the same time, they were promoting the tourist galleries of our fair city. Another sadder duty they performed was to meet the trains that carried our returning wounded soldiers. They were among the first in Canada to do this, and their compassion was much appreciated by the men. They would hand out items such as sweets, apples, tobacco, etc., and try to lift up the spirits of the soldiers. They were instrumental in the construction of the World War I memorial plaque placed on the courthouse. And incidentally, also the trees planted on the courthouse, where these were planted in May of 1917. The city took pride in all its efforts to support the war and worked hard doing this bit. Another organization that was very important to community life during the war was the Christian churches. Back in 1914, almost everyone in town was either Roman Catholic, Church of England Anglican, Presbyterian, or Methodist. Sometimes the local newspaper printed their ministers' sermons. When war started, the churches were called upon for their support, and they did not waver. In January 1915, the churches were asked to conduct prayers for peace and victory. The minister's sermons, messages were all printed in the paper. Reading these gives one a flavor for the enthusiasm and determination and commitment to the war effort of the people of Revelstoke. It also gave me an important insight into what the ministers, and most likely their congregations, believed were the reasons they were fighting this war. At one point during the war, the local ministers were asked to preach recruiting sermons by the Board of Trade, a precursor to our Chamber of Commerce. These also were printed in the paper. These messages consisted primarily of appeals to duty, responsibility, commitment, patriotism, and a crusade against evil in the world, identified as German militarism. The churches, along with other organizations, such as the YMCA and the fire brigades, constructed honor rolls listing all the volunteers in their denomination or organization who had joined up in the war effort. Let us now return to the fall of 1914. Those men not needed for the first contingent were either put to duty guarding CPR rail bridges or practicing their marksmanship and drilling at the drill hall. The rest of the city was very busy socially, as it was for most of the first 3 years of the war, entertaining our volunteer soldiers, holding dances, picnics, church gatherings, sporting events, and other social activities. The paper also carried entertaining accounts of house parties and sleigh rides out to Greedy Creek. A second contingent of volunteers was quickly called, and in November 1914, they marched in a body from Joe Hall and boarded a train for Victoria, where they trained over the winter. An interesting letter from the Camp Victoria, printed in the paper, noted that some of the boys had met up with some Revelstoke girls at the local skating rink and enjoyed an afternoon of skating. In the meantime, the first contingent had sailed from Valcartier, Quebec, and were now encamped on the Salisbury Plain in England, where they endured horrendous living conditions in the damp English winter. The second contingent sailed over to England in the early spring of 1915 and joined the first. Many letters were received from the men describing their adventures with mostly good humor. The train rides across the country were inspiring experiences for our volunteer soldiers and were an important bonding experience to identifying themselves as Canadians rather than British. More than 75% of the earliest volunteers have been born in Britain and were recent immigrants. They were greeted enthusiastically by the Canadian people everywhere they went. But things were about to change in the spring of 1915. In April of 1915, the Canadian Corps endured its baptism of fire. They had been placed on the Ypres salient on the Western Front in Belgium, when shortly after their arrival, the German army attacked using a new weapon of war. In addition to the usual killing instruments of artillery, machine gun, and rifle shot, the German commanders tried an experiment using chlorine gas for the first time in modern warfare. Despite tremendous losses, the Canadians managed to hold the front. Revelstoke suffered its first casualties of the war. Walter Robinson and John Boyle, two men who had very close ties to our community. John Boyle was the son of a local baker and the brother of Alan Boyle, who later became a long-serving alderman of this city in the 1930s and 1940s. Alan Boyle's son became an admiral in the Canadian Navy. John Boyle was only 17 or 18 years old when he was killed. His body was never found or identified, and his name is memorialized on the Ypres Benegate Memorial in France. Walter Robinson had a brother, Arthur Robinson, who perished later in the war. Both Robinson brothers were born in Revelstoke in the 1890s. This was the only brother combination of Revelstoke to die in the war. Numerous other brother combinations served, but they managed to survive. The Robinsons were early logging pioneers in Revelstoke. As can be imagined, these deaths had quite an impact upon the city, and there were numerous articles about them. Also at this time, letters began reaching home, describing in graphic detail the fighting the men had endured. Some of these were printed in the paper. I was extremely surprised to read such graphic descriptions of the violence and suffering the men had endured. My guess is that the authorities thought these letters were too graphic also, because I never saw another letter in the newspaper again with such detail. The letters towards the end of the war were mostly travelogues with humorous descriptions of life at the front. In the spring and summer of 1915, Canada stepped up in its recruitment of soldiers. Perhaps the most famous local regiment of the war came into being at this time. The 54th Kootenay Battalion was ready to receive the men of the Kootenay and Camus area. By the summer of 1915, some 100 men from this area alone were training in Vernon. These were exciting times in the city, with numerous patriotic receptions and events put on to encourage and support our volunteer soldiers. One such event was the reception held at the Lindmark home on Mackenzie Avenue, now the home of Doctors Ferrugia and MacDonald. At the Lindmark home, there was at that time a balcony around the second floor, and from there speeches were given, and underneath the balcony, the city band played patriotic songs and popular tunes of the day. The citizens wandered about the magnificent lawns and gardens, encouraging the new recruits. In addition to these events, patriotic parades and speeches were the order of the day. One such event was held on the evening of June 3rd, 1915. A parade began at 7 o'clock through the streets of the city. He was headed by the mayor and the city band, followed by the bugle band of the 102nd Regiment, the high school cadets, 54 recruits wearing the rosettes furnished by the ladies of the Red Cross Society, the Boy Scouts, and many citizens in automobiles. The parade eventually arrived at the drill hall. As the newspaper of the day put it, the streets in front of the drill hall were blocked by one of the biggest and most loyal and enthusiastic audiences ever assembled in this city. The program consisted of speeches by a number of prominent men, including clergy, solos by local artists, and music by the city band. The newspaper described the speeches this way. The keynote of the speaker's remarks showed that the paths of duty lead to the recruiting office. Great Britain is fighting for freedom and liberty against the aristocracy of German militarism. That the 54th Battalion must go forward with courage to fight for the independence of the civilized world and the independence of those who follow after them, and take their place beside those who have so nobly upheld the best traditions of Canada and the British Empire in the fighting line in France. A more succinct summary of why Canada fought in World War I have not found anywhere. These speakers felt that Canada and the British Empire were fighting for a great purpose and cause. This belief sustained them through the dark days of war still to come. As the Anglican minister C.A. Procunier put it, it is a great honor and privilege to be born under the Union Jack. Upon all true patriots lay the greatest responsibility that ever befell citizens of the Empire. The Empire needed men. Are the men before me, between the ages of 18 and 45, to prove themselves patriots or cowards? Our king and country need us. The Empire is fighting with its back to the wall as never before. It is a serious hour. Our young men will respond to the call because it is right to do so. They will be fighting on the side of right. It is their duty to enlist. They should respond to the call because they are lovers of liberty and freedom. God is on the side of right, truth, freedom, and liberty. It is our duty not only to supply soldiers and munitions, but also to pray to God to sweep away the curse from the world, to establish liberty, and to serve God with freedom. Reverend Procunier later went to France to serve as a chaplain. His son joined up and unfortunately became a prisoner of war. When word trickled back that some Revelstoke men were prisoners of war, the citizens of our town became strong supporters of the campaign to help our POWs through the Red Cross package program. Despite the exhortations of Reverend Procunier and many others, recruitment began to flag in 1916. It became more difficult to sign up replacements for all the battle losses. Talk of conscription began to be heard from our politicians and military leaders. It is only at this time that any signs of discontent or dissent reach the newspaper pages. We still have to do much reading between the lines to find much of this. Throughout the war years, our local paper, the Review, remained staunchly in favor of a vigorous prosecution of the war. The Review, also being a staunch liberal newspaper, did have a problem with the conscription issue. At the time conscription became an issue in Canada, the Federal Liberal Party was led by Sir Wilfrid Laurier. The Liberal Party had a strong base of support in Quebec, and Quebec was opposed to conscription. The Liberals and the Review tried hard to straddle this issue, which threatened to split the party and the country. French Canadians, on the whole, had no desire to fight in Britain's wars of imperialism and had little love for France, who they felt had abandoned them when Britain conquered Quebec. Nevertheless, in early 1917, conscription became the law of the land. There was a federal election in December of 1917, in which the ruling Conservatives were returned to power, including the MP from our riding. An interesting note for Revelstoke is that the candidate who was running on an anti-conscription platform garnered about 15% of the vote, and the Liberal candidate about 30%. From the election results, one could deduce that there was a significant minority of English Canadians unhappy with conscription and perhaps willing to be receptive to peace talks to end the war. I must say that when I was slogging my way through the 1917 issues of the newspapers, I was getting a bit war-weary myself. It was getting to be depressing reading. I could begin to imagine how weary the people of Revelstoke must have been. Will this war never end? In the museum we have a copy of the house and family history. They were early merchants and funeral undertakers in Revelstoke. The house and block across the City Hall at what is now the Minto Manor on Mackenzie Avenue and the former Deptford House on the 9th Street corner were built by them. In this family history, there is a reflection on what life was like here in the latter part of the war. Apparently, it was a practice of young people before the war who sometimes borrow a small order from the Scandinavian church on a Saturday evening. It was where Brandon's store was, and now is now the consignment store on the corner of 2nd Street and Mackenzie Avenue. And they would wheel it up Mackenzie Avenue and knock on the door and ask to be let in the party. The occupants would get up, there would be much singing and dancing. After the party is over, the borrowed organ would be returned in time for the Sunday service. Mrs. Howson recalls how much she resented having to get up and entertain these young people. Later on in the war, she missed these parties because it reminded her that there are very few young men left in town. In her view, life was getting drearier and more depressing. She recalls the tramp of the marching feet of the soldiers who had disembarked from the troop trains and marched up Mackenzie Avenue, where they turned around in front of her house and returned to the train station. She would find herself thinking how many of these young men were destined to become cannon fodder for the German guns. In the spring of 1918, at the time of the last great German offensive of the war, a note of desperation begins to creep into the newspaper. Rationing is introduced, people are exhorted to use their food more efficiently, more vegetables need to be planted and harvested for the soldiers at the front, and more bonds need to be bought to finance the war. Finally, the Allied armies regained the upper hand over the German forces, and armistice is declared on November 11, 1918. The emotions in Revelstoke on that day were mixed. There was joy, of course, on that day, but it was mingled with sadness. On November 10, 1918, Ellen Daniel MacDonald, a recently returned soldier working on the railway, succumbed to what was euphemistically called trench fever. This is probably another term for a lung disease that he had developed from living in the trench conditions at the front. His funeral was held on November 11, 1918 at the Catholic Church. After the funeral, his body was to be transported to the train depot for return to his family in eastern Canada. The city delayed the beginning of the end of war celebration in order to allow the funeral procession to wind its way down Mackenzie Avenue and across the railway crossing. Then the victory parade would start. Peace had come to Canada and to Revelstoke. The war to end all wars had run its course. Some 100 men in the Revelstoke area paid the supreme sacrifice. They had answered the call and now mostly buried in Europe. Who knew that 20 years later, the sons of these men would once again be called to serve their country in another world war.
Thank you, Ken. I'm just going to read a couple of the profiles that we put together in the memorial books. You can see there's a one-page summary of each man. When we do the project with the secondary school, the grade 11 socials class, we give them copies of the files with all of the information on, so they can write their own profiles, and it gives them a chance to see the information that was gathered and try to get a picture of these men and what their lives were like. One I'm going to read to you is John Kalia. He was born June 20th, 1893 in Cosenza, Italy. He came first to the United States and then to Canada with some of his family members around 1907. He was the son of Santo Kalia, and at the time of his enlistment he was working for the CPR. He enlisted on December 20th, 1915 with the 172nd Battalion at Kamloops. He was 22 years of age at the time, single, 5'7" tall, with black hair and brown eyes. He was a Roman Catholic, as most of the Italians were. He had been with the 102nd Rocky Mountain Rangers for 16 months prior to signing up. It said that he had tried to join up earlier, but he wasn't needed at that time, so he was put on bridge guard duty. Upon arrival in England, he was transferred to the 54th Kootenay Battalion, and he died on April 9th, 1917, at the Battle for Vimy Ridge. He was one of the 12 people from Revelstoke who died at Vimy. He was 24 years of age at the time of his death, and was a private in the 54th Canadian Infantry Central Ontario Regiment. He was buried at the Canadian Cemetery No. 2 in France. Last year, our local school teacher, Lisa Cancella Sykes, took a group of high school students to Europe for the Canadian Battlefields tour, and they went to the Canadian Cemetery No. 2, and Rosemary Tracy, who is a descendant of John Kalia, prepared a little memorial with poppies and his photograph, and the local high school students were actually able to visit his grave. And we have a photograph here of his grave that they took, and a little memorial that they placed beside it. So it was very meaningful for them as well to actually make that connection with somebody who still has family in Revelstoke. His death was written in the Revelstoke Review of May 17th, 1917. Word was received by Mr. Bruno Kalia that his brother, Private John Kalia, was wounded on April 3rd and died April 9th. Born in Italy 24 years ago, he came to Canada from the United States about 10 years ago. Shortly after the war broke out, he enlisted with the 102nd RMR and served as a bridge guard for some months. Wishing to serve the country of his adoption more effectively, he enlisted with the 172nd Battalion. Private Kalia was the son of Santo Kalia and a brother of Bruno Kalia, section foreman out of Revelstoke on the South Branch. Two sisters are also left to mourn his loss. And John's brother Bruno lived in Revelstoke for the rest of his life, and he lived to be 101. Quite a few of you would probably knew Bruno. And John Kalia's name is inscribed on both the courthouse and the cenotaph plaques. On the slideshow, I had a photograph of Louis Dame, and he died December 9th, 1918. He was born October 11th, 1893 in Revelstoke, the son of Camille Dame and Johanna Maria Goldman Dame, both born in Belgium. He had 9 siblings. And an interesting incident involving Louis Dame's nephew occurred just before he enlisted, as chronicled in the Revelstoke Mail Herald of January 20th, 1915. Some of you in town might have known Joris Dame. Joris and Mary were longtime residents, but Joris was over with other family members in Belgium just at the outbreak of the war, and he was, I think, 3 years old at the time. And because of the conflict and some of the things that were happening, he and an older relative, either a cousin or a young woman who was with him, they actually got separated, and they were lost in Belgium for some time. And it said the Miss Dame, his aunt, walked from Alost to Holland, a 12-hour tramp, carrying the little boy all the way. From Holland, they took a boat to England and and finally got back to Canada. So when Louis Dame signed his enlistment papers on January 14th, 1916 at Vancouver. He was 22 years old, single, 5 foot 9 inches tall, with brown hair and brown eyes. At the time of his enlistment, he'd been working as a blacksmith, and his religion was Roman Catholic. He was wounded by shrapnel to his thigh on November 3rd, 1918, and died less than a month later, probably from infection. So of course, when he was wounded, it was just 8 days before the end of the war. He was 25 years old at the time of his death, and was a private in the 102nd Battalion Canadian Infantry. His body was found because he died of wounds afterwards, and he was buried in the Brockwood Military Cemetery in Surrey, in England. He was, all of the families of the men who died were given these little bronze memorial plaques, and we have his on display in our First World War display downstairs. And there are still family members of the Dane family still in Revelstoke. One more I'll read is Leo McKinnon. He was born March 2nd, 1887 in Nova Scotia, and his brother Hector McKinnon was Revelstoke's mayor for most of the war years. And his brother Hector and another brother Joe built the McKinnon block that now houses the Nickelodeon Museum, and they ran McKinnon's Pool Hall on First Street. Hector also had a large dairy farm just below where Downey Street Sawmills is now, the Standard Dairy. When Leo McKinnon signed his enlistment papers on November 7th, 1914 at Victoria, he was 27 years old, single, 5 foot 3 inches tall, with dark hair and dark eyes. His religious affiliation was Roman Catholic. I don't know why it chose 3 people and they all happened to be Roman Catholic. After he reached the front in May of 1915, he sent home many letters, which were printed in the local newspaper. And he noted the names of the Revelstoke casualties and his experiences as a stretcher bearer and the dangers of snipers and shelling. On one occasion, shells burst around a group that he was in while they were preparing their tea. So the tea was ruined, but all of the party escaped. On another occasion, a bullet ripped a sandbag he was carrying, but he escaped injury. He said that he was trying to send off his diary if the officers would pass it. He also had some nerve-wracking experiences in no man's land. He was eventually wounded at the Battle of the Somme and spent some time in hospital in England. In January of 1917, he returned to action, promoted from sergeant to lieutenant. He died on April 9, 1917 at Vimy Ridge. He was 30 years old at the time of his death and was lieutenant with the 7th Battalion. He's buried in the Nine Elms Military Cemetery in France. In May of 1917, maple trees were planted around the courthouse in memory of, in honor of all of the Revelstoke men who were serving overseas. Mayor McKinnon, as mayor, was officiating and speaking at the ceremony, and he had just received word of the death of his brother Leo. He said at the ceremony, "It is but a small thing to plant some trees in honor of our boys, but it will show that they are not forgotten, and will in years to come serve to remind these children assembled here today what they owe to the brave lads who gave up splendid positions and loved ones and adopted the maple leaf as their badge, many of them to go down to their death, that we might live in safety. Let us not forgive them, but prepare in a substantial way to receive with open arms those who may be spared to return." And of course, there are still family members living in Revelstoke. Leo McKinnon's niece, Mary Thompson, just recently passed away, and the family gave us quite a few family photographs, including a picture of Leo and a postcard that he had sent home to one of his nephews. So we have those, or copies of those on display. So to say we've got many, many of these profiles, and they could spend hours reading them. You're welcome to come in and look at them, and at any time they're part of our World War I exhibit downstairs. So again, thank you for coming today.
Thanks, Ken.